Hi guys, so now we're going to deal with conditionals. I'm going to make this video into a kind of, I think maybe three-parter, maybe four parts, not to make it so long. I'm going to start off with the basics. This is the stuff that we should know at this level. And then in the second part, I'm going to give some alternatives to conditionals, other little bits and pieces that are good to know for CAE because you could be asked about them. And then I'm going to deal with wish and all those other little bits and pieces there as well. So it's going to be kind of quite full on. But again, they ask about conditionals and all related areas very, very often in the exam, so we've really got to know it. So let's start off with this. So we know about zero conditionals. I've got two examples here. If I work hard, I always get tired. I've got my present simple. I've got present simple here. Now notice that there is nothing conditional about this. Nothing's in the subjunctive. Zero conditional means it's real life. It's called indicative. Now indicative means that it's just like, it's not subjunctive, it's not hypothetical. Now the thing is in English, what we need to understand is that unlike other languages, like say German, because I can speak German, when you make the subjunctive in German, you can add letters, add umlauts, these little two dots. Some languages have suffixes and things. English doesn't have that. So whenever we need to separate the indicative from the subjunctive, we play with our tenses and our structures. That's the only thing we can do. So you need to learn these models by heart. Now, basically, the conditional zero is indicative, so it's called the real conditional. And even though I have if here for the zero conditional, surprisingly, we actually prefer to use when, because if does sound quite hypothetical. So sometimes we often get confused between the zero and the first conditional. So in everyday English, we prefer to use when with zero conditional. But notice, zero conditional is not always just present, it can be the past as well. So I left school early if I was ill. So I'm talking about a kind of real condition that happened to me when I was younger. So the zero conditional can be present and past. It's real. The conditional one, I've got two nice examples that I'm going to compare here. If you drive like a maniac, you're going to get hurt. So basically, this is a result of this condition. So notice I've got my present simple. I've got my going to. You don't have to use will all the time. You can use going to, not a problem at all. You can use a series of modal verbs as well. Now notice here, I've got if first, and I've got my comma. I've got if very, very often. But notice here, where I've got I to start with, there is no comma before if. You only have a comma when you start with your subordinate clause. In this one, I have if I become president, again my present simple, I will invade France. Now, the thing is that with the first conditional, some books say the first conditional talks about the future. Actually, it doesn't really. It can talk about the present and future. The difference between conditional 1 and conditional 2 is conditional 1 is far more likely. So the choice between conditional 1 and conditional 2 depends on what you see as being purely hypothetical, like if there's many chances. I've got some examples to highlight this. This one is a very interesting point because notice here, after if, I actually have going to. Now, if you want to use your first conditional to really explicitly talk about the future, you can actually use, not will, but going to after if. So if you're going to be late, can you please tell me? It's a very, very common structure in conditional 1 to use going to after if. Now we go on to conditional 2. Now conditional 2 is about the present and future as well, but it's purely, utterly hypothetical, completely unreal. So for example, we know that because we actually have like the past simple. I can also use the past continuous as well, as I will show you here. If I had 5 legs, I would take up running. What are the chances of me having 5 legs? Absolutely 0. It's purely hypothetical. You would use hypothetical situations if you were talking about winning a lottery or about affording a holiday that you could never afford or staying in like the most expensive hotel in the world as a teacher. It's not going to happen. I would use conditional 2. Here, I've got, for example, in my second one, if I became president, again past simple, I would invade France. Now notice I've got the same sentence here and here. If I become president, I will invade France. If I became president, I would invade France. Now the thing is, the vocab is almost exactly the same, except for the tense and the will and the would. So the difference is, of course, if I'm using this sentence in conditional 1, it insinuates that I'm working in politics already, that maybe I'm a minister and there are chances that I can become president. In this one, because it's conditional 2, completely hypothetical, I'm some homeless alcoholic bomb and there are no chances whatsoever of me becoming president. So it's completely hypothetical. So that's why I chose that one, depending on the circumstances. Also, with conditional 2, I don't just have to have past simple, I can have past continuous as well. I would invite John if I was having a party. Now notice I've actually got was and were here, which I want to explain under this one. If I were you, I wouldn't do that. If I was you, I wouldn't do that. Now, a lot of people ask questions about is if I was or if I were. Now, if I were is subjunctive, and if I was, well, that looks like this, doesn't it? It looks like it's indicative. But the problem is, because we have shit education in England and we never learn about this, we never learn grammar at school. I never learned any grammar at school at all. I only learned English grammar because I was learning German. I had to teach myself. That we can't differentiate between them. And through bad habit, we often say if I was. However, for your CAE, I would be correct. If I were you, I wouldn't do that. So I would prefer that one. However, in the spoken part, they don't mark you wrong if you say if I was. All grammar books explain that it's acceptable, but for you guys, be correct. When we have our conditional 3, of course, it's a hypothetical situation about the past, that something we wish something had happened, but it didn't. For example, if I had known it was your birthday, so we've got my past perfect, I would have bought you a present. So you've got the would or could or might plus your perfect. I've got, for example, if John had worked harder, but he didn't, he could have become a proctologist, but he didn't become a proctologist because he didn't work hard. But if he had done, he would have become one. Now the thing is, with these structures, you just have to learn them by heart. Now most of you know this. It's really kind of simple stuff. You learn these conditionals intermediate level. But the one that I'm actually very interested in is the mixed conditional. Now, mixed conditionals, we use them in spoken English all the time. The most common mixed conditionals are mixed conditionals 2 and 3. So you have like a situation in the past which has a result now. So if John had worked harder, he would be a proctologist now. So the conditional 2 and 3 is a very common. You can mix conditionals 1 and 2 as well, not as common. I'm not going to explain those here because they're actually quite complicated. But I actually do recall a time when I experienced bad teaching, when I was ill teaching an intermediate class and a teacher covered them and they were learning about conditionals and he gave them all the mixed conditionals, 1, 2, 2, 3, 2, 1, etc. And I came back to work and they were so confused. I said to them, don't bother learning it. Not now. Only for this level you can really worry about mixed conditionals. It can be very, very difficult to master that. But 2 and 3 are generally fine. In the exam, if you have a conditional, like in your use of English part 4, like words, you might be transforming sentences. Basically, you might have the choice of using a conditional 3 or a conditional 2, depending on the context of the sentence. Generally, they don't. Generally, as complicated as it gets is conditional 3s and conditional 2s. I'm going to give you some other little nuances now that you need to know about conditionals. So I'm going to clean the board and write a load more stuff down, okay? Alright guys, so welcome back. Now we're going to move on to the next part here. These are some of the little nuances that you need to know about conditionals. Again, for some of you, most of this is revision. Conditionals do go a bit deeper. There are some other little interesting bits and pieces, but for CAE, this is all you need to know. If you were to do CPE, I would go further. So I'm not going to bore you with all the details because it's quite a big area. Let's start off with should. Now should is an interesting one. Now I've got like nice alternatives here. If you should see Paul, could you please slap him? And now, what I've even done in the second sentence, I wanted to sort of show you about inverting the conditional as well. Because basically here, should replaces if. Should you see Paul, could you please slap him? This is a lot more formal than this one. Like, you know, it's a lot more colourful, a lot more formal. Any inversion is, basically. So here, if I say if you should see Paul, it's like saying if by chance you see Paul, and it makes it rather sort of not so likely. We've got here happen. Now happen is very common, and I've seen this in a few use of Englishes actually, that's why I'm teaching you this. So I've got here, if you happen to see Paul, could you please slap him? And it basically, to be honest, means the same as this, pretty much. I can even use should as a replacement of if. Should you happen to see Paul, could you please slap him? Now this is a very sort of elevated, polite version if I say, should you happen to see Paul? Imagine if I'm like with a student and I want to ask them to do something that might be, you know, difficult or out of their way. I could say like maybe not so politely, like, if you see a shop on the way, could you buy me some chocolate? Now, if I know it's going to be difficult for that person and I'm worried it's going to bother them, I can say, should you happen to see a shop, please could you buy me some chocolate? So the whole point is, the more we use kind of inverted things like this, it creates more distance. Now, the good thing about conditionals is they really represent like the Anglosphere culture, because we don't like being direct in English. Now, we learn a very basic level, things like, would you mind me opening the window? Would you mind if I opened the window? We learn that, like, I think in pre-intermediate level. We use the conditionals because it's hypothetical. It's a way to avoid being direct. We like to go around that way because in my culture, we don't like to disappoint people. We don't like to kind of get into their personal zones, because maybe in Russia, your personal zone is here, ours is here. So conditionals is a great way to avoid that. So we have, again, here, I can also say, instead of should you happen to see Paul, if you should happen to see Paul, could you please slap him? It's your choice of what you want to say. This would be the standard. These two would be quite polite, quite elevated. And again, could you use this in your essay? Absolutely. If you're writing a part 1 essay, if the government should happen to find any solution to the problem, then blah, 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 it would be a perfect structure, even in your spoken English to some extent. Now we've got were. Now, were is an interesting one, because the first one is this. I've got this, were it not for you, or if it were not for you. You need to learn this structure by heart, because I've actually seen that in a part 2 use of English, and my students didn't get it. Because they saw if it not for, and for some reason they couldn't think of the word because they couldn't remember this expression. If I say if it were not for you, if it hadn't been for you, I like saying because of you something happened. So I can say if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be alive today. So someone saved me. As a result of that condition, I am alive today. So, you know, something, oh Paul, if it were not for your teaching, I wouldn't have passed CAE. So thank you very much. I can also invert it to make it even like more elevated. Were it not for you, I wouldn't be here. But again, no one in general spoken English would do that. Again, if I was writing a very polite letter or formal letter or speaking to the Queen, I would invert it. Otherwise, with normal people, I would not. Another interesting use of were in a conditional is this. I can say, like imagine I go to a bar and I see a nice girl in the bar and I want to ask for her phone number. So instead of saying directly, give me your phone number, which is rude, I can say, excuse me, if I asked for your number, would you give it to me, maybe? I mean, it's a bit kind of gay to speak like that, but you know, I'm shy. So I can say that, if I ask for your number, would you give it to me? If I want to make it even politer, by making it more hypothetical, more distance, I can put in were plus the infinitive. If I were to ask for your number, would you give it to me? If I were to borrow, if I were to kill your dog, would you be really angry with me? Now, let's move to suppose and imagine. Now, instead of saying if, I can actually say supposing, imagine. So imagine you had $1 billion, what would you buy? Supposing you had $1 million, what would you buy? Suppose you had $1 million, what would you buy? It's a nice alternative to if, and it really is very common. So, you know, like sometimes when you're playing a game, like imagine you had $1 million, or imagine you had a big house, how would it look? It's a very, very common structure in spoken English, and you guys should really use it. So don't always say, if you had $1 million, what would you buy? Supposing you had $1 million, what would you buy? Very, very natural, and it could be in the exam. Now, this is an interesting one. I don't think this would be in the exam, but this is just something a bit extra for you. If can actually sometimes mean although. So I can have it's quite sort of, say, colourful sentence. He's a nice guy, if a bit stupid, to be honest. This is a nice room, if a bit untidy, a little bit. So it's like saying although. He's a nice guy, although he's a bit stupid. It's a nice room, although it's a bit messy. So this is a much more elevated way to say although. Would you use it in your spoken English? If you wanted to sound a bit maybe arrogant, a bit kind of special, like he's a nice guy, if a bit stupid for my taste. It sounds very posh for some reason, but you might see it, but I don't expect you to use it. But don't forget, just like if, we've got other conjunctions such as unless, provided that, as long as, even if, and a few others. So unless is a good one, because unless means if not. So unless you kiss me, I won't marry you. Now that could be asked in the exam, because you could actually have a first sentence, maybe something like, I will marry you, providing you kiss me. Because again, unless means if not, so we kind of change it around. So I'll make that negative, so unless you kiss me, I won't marry you. Now even if is an interesting one, because even if basically means no matter what. So even if it rains, we will go for a walk. So it doesn't matter if it rains, we are still going for a walk. Now what I'm going to do in the next part, I'm actually going to deal with wish and all the other little bits that go with that, like it's time we left or it's time to leave, etc, etc. So I'll get on with that now. It'll take me 5 minutes. Okay guys, this is the final part, so it's not a far part. 4 parts, just 3, so that's fantastic. It's not a particularly long video either. Again, all of this is kind of revision, but it doesn't go much further than that in CAE. Let's start off with wish. Now, for example, I've got, I wish I had a friend. I wish I was going on holiday. So basically we have my past simple or past continuous, both past, for a wish that I wish something would happen, but it's not going to. And we know that that's why it's unreal. That's why we use the conditional or the subjunctive here. I wish I had a friend, but I don't have one. Again, we don't use the present simple here because otherwise it would be indicative. It'd be too confusing. So we shift down a tense, even though it's present. So I wish I was going on holiday, but the fact is I'm not. Now, I've actually put here, I wish to go on holiday. I can't remember who it was, but a couple of weeks ago, someone asked on one of the streamings about wish plus infinitive, and it does exist in English. But the thing is, if you actually have wish plus infinitive, what it actually means is I desire to or want. So it kind of changed the meaning. So I desire to go on holiday, I want to go on holiday. It takes these meanings, hence why it's plus infinitive, because these are plus infinitive as well. So it's not about conditionals. That's the difference there. It's just a very, very elevated way to say I want. Okay? Now we have number 2. When you have I wish he would or I wish it would, you want to say that you want something to change, but it will not. So for example, I wish he would shut up, but he won't shut up. I wish it would stop raining. It's not going to stop raining, but I wish it would. But the thing is, not just about wanting things to change. You can actually express someone's annoying habit by using this structure as well. I wish you wouldn't do that. It's something that always annoys me. Maybe someone's always constantly picking their nose or, you know, scratching their ass or something. So like I said, I really wish you would stop scratching your ass. I wish you wouldn't do that, to express my annoyance of that habit. It's kind of similar to this basically. You want it to change, but it can give the idea of a habit. If I want to express a past wish that I wanted something to change, but it couldn't, then I use my past perfect. I wish I hadn't eaten your hamster, but I did eat it. Now, the thing is with this is that, again, the wish with past perfect here is quite common in the CAE as well. I've seen it about 3 or 4 times, so I know that. But it's a very, very simple structure. Now, if I want to express an ability, I can use could. I wish I could fly. I wish I could eat 100 Big Macs in 1 minute, but I can't. Also, we use wish plus could to talk about the future as well. So I wish I could travel tomorrow, but unfortunately a volcano has just erupted. So none of these can talk about the future, only that one can. Now, we've got here this structure if only. Now, I can actually replace if only with all of these here, all of them. Absolutely all of them. Now, the difference is, basically, if only is a lot more kind of emotional. It's a lot more kind of, say, personal. It's a lot more kind of theatrical, if you understand. So if I read you some sentences in normal English with wish, so I wish I had a friend, I wish you wouldn't do that. If I'm going to replace that with if only, I would say, if only I had a friend, if only you wouldn't do that, if only I hadn't eaten your hamster. It's a very, very good structure to know, and it could be asked for. Now, we have sometimes in English, I don't know if you know this, but sometimes in English, we can actually answer with just if only. So, like, I could say to my friend, you know what, we really need some girls here with us in the bar. If only. And it's a very, very common way to answer sometimes, like, I wish we had. Now, we know this structure with it's high time we left, but I'm sure a lot of you have probably never seen the infinitive version. You can actually say both with exactly the same meaning. It's time we left, it's time to leave. Now, the only difference between them is basically grammatical. If you actually want to have the pronoun, then you have to have the conditional. It's time we left. It's high time we went now. It's high time we stopped. But if you don't want to have the pronoun, then you have the infinitive. It's time to stop, it's time to leave. And the infinitive version is very, very, very common indeed. It doesn't always have to be conditional. Now let's go on to preference. Now when we want to express a preference, we've got two ways of doing it. We have, I'd rather you didn't sing. Now I can actually also say another structure which is not very common in spoken English, but it might be in the CAE. What was it? It was like, let me just check. It's not, yeah, I'd sooner. It's so weird. I'd sooner you didn't, I don't know why I put it there, it should be there. I'd sooner you didn't sing. No one would ever say that. You'd never hear that in spoken English, only in written English, but it exists. So I'd rather you didn't sing. I could say I'd prefer it if you didn't sing. So with prefer, I need my preparatory object plus my if clause. I prefer it if you didn't sing. So they're exactly the same in meaning. Exactly the same, just slightly different. Now, we have to be careful with rather and prefer, because if you're going to, if you kind of want to express a preference that you want something to be your way, you have the conditional. But if you want to make a comparison in the indicative, of course you have the infinitive without to, the bare infinitive. I'd rather be English than French. Similarly, I prefer tea to coffee. I mean, that's just a very basic piece of English here. Actually, talking about the word prefer, it's a common mistake among Russian learners of English. When they say, oh, tell me about your hobbies. I prefer football. When you say this, my brain is finishing your sentence. My brain is saying, you prefer football to what? You can only use it to make comparisons. You can't use it to mean I like. Now, if I say, for example, I prefer you, if I use like the pronoun here, I prefer you to sit in your seat. Basically, that's just like saying, I prefer you to sit on your seat rather than on the floor. There has to be some kind of comparison, but I don't need to finish it if the context is clear. Very, very simple structures there. The last one we have is as if and as though. Now, there's actually two variants of this. You can have as if and as though with indicative or with subjunctive, depending if the situation is real or not. So in this one, I've got, you look as if you hate me. Now, that would be real, because imagine if I just kicked some girl's hamster and she's looking at me with evil eyes. I said, whoa, you look as if you really hate me. She goes, yes, I do. So it would be real. I don't use as though in spoken English because it's quite formal. As if is much more common. Here, I can say he acts as if he were in charge, or to be more informal, he acts as if he was in charge. But he's not in charge, but he's acting as if he were. So therefore, it would be unreal, and I would have to make that conditional. But notice with this, I can even make the first one present perfect, present continuous, any type of present tense, it doesn't matter whatsoever. You look as if you have seen a ghost, okay? Now, if I wanted to make that conditional, you look as if you saw a ghost. That would be the unreal version. So guys, I hope that makes that a bit clear. So there's about maybe 20 something minutes of conditionals here. That's all you need to know for CAE. It really, really is. I expect to see conditionals in some of your spoken English because it adds effect. I especially expect to see some of your conditionals in your essays. But most importantly, you've got to recognize conditionals when you do your use of English, because they will appear almost 95%. At least one of the things I've explained will be there. And all the practice tests that you go through over time, you will recognize them, and you've got this to help you. So I hope that was useful. Do the practice in, I think it is my grammar lab. I've used different sources for this, but my grammar lab can give a bit extra. So do the reading as well. Read the theory one more time to support what I've said, plus a few other bits and pieces, and do the practice. And I actually like the practice in this book here, which is Michael Vince, Language Practice for Advanced, because it's actually in the CAE format. Unfortunately, my grammar lab, and I don't know why, the best explanations for grammar in my opinion, but the practice is nowhere near the format of the exam. But it's still very good practice anyway. Okay guys, I'm going to move on to do the reading.